Growing up, I always believed my parents were fair. My brother and I were close in age, and they often made a big deal about equal opportunities and equal college funds. I remember sitting at the kitchen table when they announced they had set aside identical sums for each of us. I was thrilled. My whole life, I'd imagined going to a top-tier school, earning a degree, and making a career that made me proud. My parents' words gave me hope that my dreams weren't just wishful thinking. They were supported, nurtured, and planned for. But reality had a different agenda. I first realized something was off when I turned 18 and started asking questions about how to access my college fund. My parents shrugged it off, offering excuses. It's all there, just give it a few weeks to process, or you don't really need to stress over it yet. I took their reassurances at face value, not wanting to doubt them. A year later, I started noticing subtle hints. My brother was 22 at the time, and he had a habit of landing himself in trouble, mostly minor infractions, but occasionally things that cost money. One evening, I overheard a conversation between my parents and a distant cousin about bailing him out of jail and making sure he doesn't hit rock bottom. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was some random expense, unrelated to my life. But then, my father made the comment that would forever change my trust. Your sister, your son's college fund? Don't worry about that. You'll probably end up divorced and living off some man anyway. I froze. That wasn't just a casual insult. It was dismissive, condescending, and cruel. My chest tightened, and the room felt impossibly small. I had spent years believing in their support, only to discover that the money that was supposed to fund my education had vanished to cover my brother's mistakes. They'd literally robbed me of an opportunity they had promised. I confronted them the next day. My voice shook as I asked, "Where's my college fund?" My mother looked away, and my father chuckled in that irritating, dismissive way he always did. "You don't need college," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Life has other plans for you. You'll figure it out." I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something, but instead, I left the room quietly, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. For weeks, I wrestled with my anger. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and abandoned. But anger alone doesn't build futures. I realized I had two choices: let this define me, or fight to create my own path. I chose the latter. I started researching scholarships, part-time jobs, and any possible avenue to finance my education independently. I applied to every program I could afford, wrote essays late into the night after working shifts at the local grocery store, and saved every dollar I could. Working two jobs while studying full-time wasn't easy. My days started before dawn and often didn't end until late at night. I stocked shelves, waited tables, tutored younger students, and sometimes went without meals just to cover rent and tuition. Friends and classmates would occasionally comment on my exhaustion, but I shrugged it off. I couldn't afford pity. Every dollar I earned, every paper I wrote, every exam I passed was a brick in the foundation of my independence. Despite the constant struggle, I found moments of triumph. I earned top marks in classes, received recognition for my volunteer work, and even managed to participate in research projects. Each achievement was proof that I didn't need my parents' support or their approval to succeed. The anger and pain I felt toward them became fuel, driving me to prove not to them, but to myself, that I was capable. Years passed. I eventually got accepted into medical school, a place I had dreamed of since childhood. It was rigorous, grueling, and demanding, but it was also transformative. I built a life defined by my own choices, hard work, and perseverance. I had financial independence, professional respect, and the knowledge that I had earned every bit of it without anyone undermining me. Then, the universe, or perhaps my parents, decided to test me again. A few months after I graduated and began practicing medicine, I received a call from my parents. They sounded cheerful, almost casual. "We're helping your brother's kid get into private school," they said. "We were hoping you could make a family donation." I froze for a moment. My first instinct was to hang up, but I stayed on the line, listening to their request. My parents' expectation was that I would comply quietly, that I would once again fund someone else's future while they ignored my sacrifices. But this time, I had no intention of complying. Instead, I smiled. Well, they couldn't see me, but I imagined the smile in my mind. And I said, calmly but firmly, "I already made a donation. I donated my parents to the trash." There was silence on the other end. My mother sputtered, my father laughed nervously, and then the line went quiet. I didn't need to say more. The words hung in the air like a verdict, and it felt like closure. I had survived their manipulation, reclaimed my future, and established boundaries that they could no longer cross. Looking back, I realized how much this journey had shaped me. The betrayal, the struggle, and the hardship had been brutal, but they had also forged resilience, independence, and an unshakable sense of self-worth. I had turned their dismissal into motivation, their greed into fuel, and their negligence into an opportunity to rise above. I often share this story, not as a way to boast, but as a testament to the power of perseverance. People will let you down, sometimes in ways that feel catastrophic, but it's never too late to take control of your life. Your worth isn't measured by someone else's generosity or approval. It's measured by the choices you make when no one else is watching. By the time I looked at my life now, my career, my home, my freedom, I realized I had already given myself everything I had ever wanted. And not because anyone handed it to me, but because I refused to accept anything less than what I deserved. The anger and hurt of my parents' betrayal still lingered occasionally, but it no longer dictated my choices. I had the ultimate power to live a life fully mine, to protect my future, and to set an example for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. I had turned their dismissal into triumph, their manipulation into independence. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely, unapologetically free. After that phone call with my parents, I spent a few days reflecting. I realized that what hurt most wasn't the money or even the insults. It was the pattern. A lifetime of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated as disposable had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully recognized. They had used me, ignored me, and manipulated the narrative around me, all while presenting themselves as supportive, caring parents. I had to admit that their approval would never come, and I had to stop craving it. It wasn't easy. For years, I had measured my achievements against their standards, hoping one day they'd see my worth. Every promotion, every academic honor, every milestone in life had been undercut by their subtle comments or blatant disregard. But when I finally said the words, "I donated my parents to the trash," I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just about rejecting their request for money. It was about reclaiming my autonomy. For a while, I avoided them entirely. Phone calls went unanswered. Emails remained unopened. I deleted their contact information from my phone. Social media became a space I could control. I started posting my achievements without tagging them, sharing my milestones with friends and colleagues instead. There was a strange thrill in knowing that they couldn't diminish or control these moments anymore. The very things they had belittled me for, my education, my career, my independence, were now proof that I had succeeded without them. Meanwhile, my brother remained in their good graces. He had always relied on their support and connections, and my parents delighted in painting him as the golden child. I watched from afar as they funded his life, helped him move into apartments, bailed him out of financial trouble, and even sent him on vacations I would never have afforded. It stung, of course, but I refused to let their favoritism dictate my emotional state. I had learned that their approval was a bonus, not a necessity. I began focusing on long-term goals, ones that didn't involve them at all. I invested in my career, built savings, and even started mentoring younger colleagues and students who faced similar family dynamics. Helping them navigate academic and financial challenges gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. I was taking the pain of my past and turning it into something constructive, something that didn't just benefit me, but helped others break free from toxic family patterns. Then came the real test. One day, I received a letter from my father's bank. They had sent a notice requesting confirmation for a joint financial transaction related to my brother's investments. At first, I considered ignoring it. But then I realized that silence wasn't enough. I wanted to assert my boundaries fully. I drafted a letter, calmly and professionally, stating that I had no involvement in my brother's financial affairs and would not authorize any transactions. I signed it and sent it back, making sure to keep a copy for my records. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. It was proof that I could enforce limits without guilt, without fear, and without drama. For the first time, I saw my parents not as authority figures whose opinions I had to navigate, but as individuals whose influence over me had been stripped. I was no longer a pawn in their family theater. I had agency, and I wielded it carefully, deliberately, and confidently. My career began to flourish. I landed a highly competitive residency program and eventually specialized in a field I had always been passionate about. Every patient I helped, every case I successfully navigated, every recommendation I received from colleagues reinforced my self-worth. My parents' dismissive words no longer had the power to erode my confidence. I was building a life that was undeniably mine, a life they couldn't touch or taint. Even when they tried to reinsert themselves, sending me messages about family gatherings, birthdays, or holidays, I maintained distance. I didn't reply immediately, and when I did, my responses were neutral and brief. I realized that I didn't owe them explanations or apologies for taking control of my life. Their disappointment was not my responsibility. For the first time, I lived without the constant need for validation from people who had consistently undervalued me. One night, while going through some old family photos, I came across a picture of me as a teenager, smiling awkwardly at a school event, my parents standing behind me with fake smiles. I felt a rush of emotions: hurt, nostalgia, anger, but also pride. I had endured years of subtle cruelty, of favoritism, and of outright dismissal. Yet here I was, building a life they could neither manipulate nor diminish. I felt gratitude, not for them, but for the resilience their treatment had inadvertently forced me to develop. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't post anything to embarrass them, I didn't confront them publicly, and I didn't try to humiliate my brother. My satisfaction came from knowing that my life was thriving because of my efforts, not because of their approval or support. Every milestone I reached was a testament to my ability to create opportunity from adversity. Then came the final piece of closure. My brother's child was now in private school, funded by my parents, and they reached out to me again, hinting at needing assistance with tuition or activities. I replied politely but firmly, reiterating that I had my own responsibilities and priorities, and that I had already made a donation. The silence that followed was telling. They had expected compliance and manipulation, but instead, they were met with autonomy and self-sufficiency. In that moment, I realized I had won, not because I had bested them, but because I had reclaimed my power. I no longer sought their approval, their validation, or even their acknowledgement. My life, my success, and my happiness were built entirely on my own terms. I looked back and thought about how far I had come, from a teenager betrayed and dismissed, to an adult who had not only survived but thrived despite systemic favoritism and neglect. I had transformed anger into determination, injustice into resilience, and cruelty into motivation. And while the scars remained, they no longer dictated my life. They were merely reminders of the strength I had cultivated along the way. I had learned that family doesn't always define you, and sometimes you have to protect your own future even from the people who claim to love you. My parents may have taken my college fund, but they could never take my drive, my intellect, or my resolve. I had created a life that was authentically mine, a life untainted by their biases, and a life I could be proud of. By the time I graduated med school, I had become accustomed to a quiet sense of accomplishment, one that didn't require anyone's validation except my own. My parents weren't at my graduation, my brother's family had flown in for a vacation, and I wasn't surprised. What they didn't realize was that their absence had no bearing on my pride. Walking across that stage, accepting my diploma, I felt the weight of years of struggle lift off my shoulders. Every long night working 2 jobs, every missed social event, every dollar saved had led to this moment. It was mine, entirely mine, and no one could diminish it. Shortly after graduation, I secured my residency in a well-respected hospital. The program was competitive, and I quickly learned that competence, diligence, and compassion mattered far more than family approval. I was in an environment where merit ruled, and I thrived. Colleagues started to recognize my capabilities, and I began earning a reputation as someone reliable, insightful, and capable of handling high-pressure situations without breaking a sweat. For the first time, my abilities were appreciated purely on their own merit. I remember one particularly difficult rotation in the ICU. A patient was deteriorating rapidly, and every second counted. My hands moved almost instinctively as I coordinated with the nurses, adjusted medications, and monitored vitals. When we stabilized the patient, the attending physician looked at me with genuine respect, and said, "You handled that flawlessly. You have a gift." I felt a rush of validation, not from family, not from anyone who had underestimated me, but from people who understood the work, the stakes, and the skill required. That moment was profoundly different from the hollow praise I had spent years craving at home. As my career progressed, my parents occasionally reached out, though always with ulterior motives. They asked about potential assistance for my brother's child's schooling, hinted at contributions to family events, and even subtly suggested I share resources they had denied me for years. Each time, I responded calmly and firmly. I reinforced my boundaries without anger or theatrics. They were used to compliance or manipulation, and when they met instead with autonomy, I could sense their confusion and, frankly, their frustration. The tipping point came when my parents asked me to co-sign a loan for my brother's new business venture. I paused for a moment and remembered everything. The college fund, the years of favoritism, the insults disguised as jokes. I drafted a concise, polite email stating that I had my own financial responsibilities and would not be involved in his business dealings. I left no room for negotiation. Hitting send felt both liberating and satisfying. For the first time, I wasn't just refusing. I was asserting my life on my terms, without guilt, without compromise. Outside of family drama, I began building my own legacy. I saved diligently, invested strategically, and eventually purchased a small condo that I could call my own. It wasn't just a roof over my head. It was a symbol that I could create security, comfort, and pride for myself without relying on the people who had dismissed me. Moving in, decorating, and making the space feel like home gave me a deep sense of ownership, both literally and metaphorically. I also began mentoring younger students from underprivileged or challenging family backgrounds. Sharing my story, offering advice, and simply listening became a form of therapy for me and empowerment for them. I realized that my parents' neglect had inadvertently prepared me to understand struggle, perseverance, and the importance of personal agency. Guiding others through similar experiences gave me a sense of purpose that no familial approval could replicate. It was during one of these mentorship sessions that the irony of life struck me. A student asked, "How did you stay motivated when people kept telling you you'd fail?" I paused, thinking about all those years of subtle, consistent dismissal. I replied, "I stopped trying to prove them wrong. I started trying to prove myself right." That distinction resonated with them, and it reminded me of the fundamental lesson I had learned. Your life, your success, and your happiness don't require validation from those who can't see your worth. Meanwhile, my brother's dependence on our parents became increasingly apparent. Every venture, every mishap, every request for assistance was a constant reminder of what I had been denied. Yet, I didn't gloat or confront him directly. I realized that his struggles were not my battle. My victory wasn't in his failure, it was in my independence. I had built something solid, sustainable, and self-respecting, while he remained tethered to the whims of others. Then came the moment that truly underscored my journey. My parents reached out, this time with desperation. Their own financial mismanagement had caught up with them, and my brother's ventures weren't yielding returns. They asked for help, phrasing it as concern and family responsibility. I listened, acknowledged their situation briefly, and reminded them that I had already donated what I could. My parents themselves had been my final gift to my independence. No guilt, no theatrics, just a calm, clear boundary. I could sense the frustration through the screen. They had expected leverage, compliance, or at least emotional manipulation. Instead, they faced someone who had carved a life apart from them, someone who had learned to thrive without needing their input or approval. In that moment, I understood that true empowerment isn't revenge, it's self-sufficiency. It's creating a life that cannot be undermined by the people who tried to diminish you. Looking back, the journey from that small, resentful teenager to a self-reliant, accomplished adult was more than just career achievements and financial independence. It was about understanding my value, setting boundaries, and refusing to let family toxicity dictate my worth. Every struggle, every insult, and every slight had been a stepping stone, forcing me to develop resilience, strategy, and clarity about what I wanted from life. By the time I settled into my career fully, I realized the final irony. My parents had spent decades trying to control the narrative, to prioritize my brother over me, to undermine my confidence. And yet, It was I who had created a life they couldn't influence, couldn't diminish, and couldn't ignore. I had succeeded entirely on my terms, and there was no coming back from that. I smiled, knowing that I had reached a point of real triumph, not in wealth or titles, but in mastery over my own life. The past could no longer touch me. The years of neglect and favoritism had built a foundation of resolve, independence, and perspective that would carry me forward, unshaken and proud. By the time I was settling into my career and building a stable life, I realized something important. The story of my parents' favoritism over my brother didn't just shape my childhood. It had prepared me for adulthood. Every moment of neglect, every dismissive comment about my capabilities, every subtle insult about my lack of future became fuel. I had learned to be meticulous, strategic, and relentless in pursuing what mattered to me. Success was no longer just a dream. It was a deliberate construction. One pivotal moment came when I received my first sizable bonus from my hospital residency. It wasn't astronomical, but it was significant enough to finally feel like my hard work was paying off. My parents, as expected, assumed I'd continue funneling money into family obligations, especially to support my brother's ventures. That expectation never materialized. Instead, I decided to treat myself, and in doing so, make a statement. I invested in a small but comfortable apartment in a part of the city that I had long admired. For once, I wasn't asking for permission, nor did I care about anyone's opinion. It was my space, my rules, and my validation. I furnished it carefully, blending function and aesthetic. Each choice was deliberate, a reflection of years of restraint finally given freedom. I remember sitting on my new couch, sipping coffee, and realizing how liberating it felt not to be beholden to anyone's whims. There was no guilt, no shame, just the quiet satisfaction of autonomy. My parents could call me lazy or spoiled all they wanted. I knew they had underestimated the depth of my resolve. Shortly after moving in, I began expanding my professional network. I joined medical associations, attended conferences, and started contributing to research papers. Each achievement reinforced the independence I had fought so hard for. People in my field recognized my work on its own merit. Unlike the approval I once sought from my parents, this recognition was earned and deserved. It didn't feel hollow, it felt empowering. Then came a particularly symbolic moment. My parents reached out once again, this time with an email framed as concern. They wanted to discuss ways I could help my brother with another business venture, implying financial support or strategic advice. I read the message, took a deep breath, and responded with composed clarity. I reminded them of the years of neglect and favoritism, of the college funds drained, and of my consistent independence. I declined politely but firmly. I was no longer a child who could be guilted or pressured. I was an adult whose life didn't revolve around their convenience. Around this time, my brother's ventures began faltering. My parents, predictably, turned to me again. They painted the situation as urgent, framing it as a family emergency. For a brief moment, I felt the old stirrings of empathy, but only briefly. I realized that if I had stepped in, it wouldn't have been because I owed anyone. It would have been out of compassion, not obligation. That distinction made all the difference. I chose to remain detached, not cruel, but firm. Their reliance on me without acknowledging past wrongs had no place in my present life. Professionally, I continued to rise. I had developed a reputation for excellence, but also for strategic thinking and calm composure under pressure. Colleagues started seeking my mentorship, and younger residents looked to me as a role model. I could see the contrast between my life and my parents' expectations. Where they assumed I would fail, I was thriving, respected, and influential. That quiet victory was sweeter than any dramatic confrontation could have been. As my financial stability solidified, I began planning long-term investments. I purchased additional properties and diversified my portfolio. Each decision was measured and deliberate, a testament to years of learning patience and self-reliance. I took pride in creating security for myself that couldn't be shaken by anyone else's whims. For the first time, I felt untouchable, not in arrogance, but in quiet confidence. Family contact became sporadic. Calls from my parents were often perfunctory, hinting at obligations that no longer existed. Invitations to gatherings were declined politely. I had learned that participation on their terms was meaningless. Autonomy was far more rewarding. The old feelings of resentment had transformed into a sense of clarity. I understood exactly who I was and what I valued, and nothing from my past could derail that. Then came the most ironic twist. My parents, confronted with their financial mismanagement and my brother's failing ventures, came to me in desperation. They assumed I would help. After all, hadn't I always been the responsible one in their eyes? I listened carefully, acknowledged their situation, and calmly reminded them of everything they had denied me over the years. My response wasn't angry or vindictive. It was firm, a reflection of the life I had built without them. They were forced to confront the reality that their past actions had created a child capable of thriving entirely independently. I realized then that my triumph wasn't in financial gains, nor in professional accolades, nor even in the satisfaction of having my parents recognize their own errors. My triumph was in the clarity and control I had achieved over my life. I had taken every slight, every insult, every denial, and transformed it into motivation. I had created a life that could not be manipulated, undermined, or diminished by the people who had once claimed ownership over me. That was freedom. I also began giving back in meaningful ways, mentoring, volunteering, and supporting causes that mattered to me. These actions were not about impressing my family, but about using my experiences to help others navigate challenges I had faced. In doing so, I found a deeper purpose, one that transcended personal vindication and became about creating positive impact. Reflecting on the past, I could see the full arc of my journey. I had moved from being a disregarded child to an independent adult who commanded respect, built a thriving career, and created a secure, fulfilling life. The journey had been painful, filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but it had also been transformative. Every act of denial from my parents, every slight from my brother, had inadvertently built resilience, focus, and clarity in me. I had turned adversity into advantage. Ultimately, I learned that the most profound victories are often silent. They aren't about proving people wrong or seeking revenge. They are about proving to yourself that you are capable, worthy, and unstoppable. I had achieved that, quietly, steadily, and with purpose. By the time I reached my late 20s, I had built a life entirely on my own terms. The apartment I had purchased with my first substantial bonus was now part of a small real estate portfolio, each property a tangible testament to years of perseverance. My career was flourishing. I had earned respect in my field, mentored younger colleagues, and even started contributing to research projects that gained national recognition. But more importantly, I had achieved a sense of peace and autonomy that my parents had never allowed me to experience as a child. The final act in this long journey of quiet vindication came unexpectedly. One afternoon, I received a call from my parents, which was unusual. Their voices were strained, tinged with desperation. My brother had made another poor investment, and this time the repercussions were more severe than anything before. Their financial instability was laid bare, and they wanted help, again assuming I would step in, as though I were obligated to bail them out. I listened without interruption, acknowledging their plight. And then I asked myself a question that had guided me for years. Was this a moment for empathy or obligation? The answer was clear. I would not be complicit in a cycle that had once attempted to deny me a future. Instead, I made a decision that was both compassionate and principled. I agreed to offer them guidance, teaching them how to negotiate with creditors and restructure debts, but I refused to provide financial support. No more bailouts. No more rescues. They had underestimated my resilience and foresight for decades, and now they were confronted with the reality that I was in control of my resources, not them. The conversation was tense at first. Their frustration was palpable, but over time, they realized I was no longer the child they could manipulate. Their pleas, their guilt trips, their subtle coercions, none of it worked anymore. They had, for years, assumed my life would revolve around theirs. They had assumed I would remain dependent, pliable, and easily controlled. And for the first time, they experienced the full measure of independence that I had cultivated. Around this same period, I also began repairing my own sense of family on my terms. I had built relationships with friends and mentors who respected me, supported me, and saw me for who I truly was. For the first time, family wasn't only about blood, it was about shared values, trust, and mutual respect. I hosted small gatherings in my apartment, inviting people who genuinely cared, people who understood the meaning of reciprocity and empathy. Watching the space fill with laughter, conversation, and warmth, I realized how starkly different it was from the dynamic I had grown up with. This was family as it should have been: chosen, supportive, and nurturing. A few months later, my parents reached out again, not with requests, but with acknowledgement. The tone was tentative, almost apologetic. They asked about my work, my properties, my plans. I shared selectively, careful to maintain boundaries. I didn't gloat, and I didn't need to. Their awareness that I had succeeded on my own, built a life they couldn't control, was more than enough. Silence, patience, and consistent success had spoken louder than any argument ever could. There was also a moment of poetic closure with my brother. After years of watching him make reckless decisions while I bore the brunt of judgment from our parents, I finally had an opportunity to set boundaries without malice. I sat him down and explained, calmly and clearly, that I would no longer participate in financial rescues or take responsibility for his failures. I framed it as a lesson in accountability, not revenge. To my surprise, he began to see the consequences of his actions, not as punishment from me, but as lessons from life itself. As the years passed, I noticed a transformation in myself. The anger and frustration that had fueled my early motivation had softened into a quiet confidence. I had achieved success not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove to myself that I was capable, resilient, and worthy. My sense of self-worth was no longer contingent on parental validation or familial approval. I had cultivated a life that was rich in achievement, autonomy, and meaningful relationships. Occasionally, I would reflect on the moments that had defined this journey: the stolen college funds, the dismissive comments, the belittling of my achievements. I realized that each of those moments had been a test, and I had passed not by confrontation, but by quietly excelling. My parents' assumptions, my brother's recklessness, and the systemic bias I experienced had inadvertently equipped me with tools for success: resilience, strategic thinking, patience, and the ability to prioritize my goals. The culmination of this journey came not with drama or spectacle, but with everyday victories. I could pay my bills without worry, mentor younger professionals, invest in ventures I believed in, and enjoy a home that was entirely mine. I could take vacations without guilt, make decisions without interference, and celebrate achievements without needing approval. And in that quiet control, I found the ultimate satisfaction. Occasionally, my parents would reach out, sometimes seeking advice, other times simply checking in. I responded thoughtfully, maintaining clear boundaries. They were no longer the center of my life, and their approval no longer dictated my happiness. I had created a future independent of their biases, a future that they could observe but never dictate. Looking back, I realized the real triumph was never financial or professional. It was emotional. I had transformed every slight, every dismissive word, every act of favoritism into a framework for growth. I had built a life that was sustainable, rewarding, and self-determined. And as I watched my daughter thrive, surrounded by love and support that I had intentionally cultivated, I knew I had broken the cycle. I had ensured that her life would be defined by encouragement and opportunity, not by comparison or neglect. In the end, the lesson was clear: revenge is unnecessary when success is attainable. The quiet victories, the ones that manifest in independence, achievement, and emotional resilience, speak louder than any confrontation ever could. I had turned a childhood of neglect into a foundation for empowerment. I had transformed anger into motivation and pain into wisdom. And in doing so, I had not only rewritten my story, but also ensured that the next generation in my family would inherit a legacy of support, respect, and opportunity, qualities I had earned entirely on my own.